Another industry that had caused a real boom in Western expansion was the farming industry, agriculture. 1870s and 1880s, a significant number of people came out west um, with the idea that they were going to have a farm. And several different things caused further expansion of that idea. One was rail. The railroads were getting cheaper and cheaper, and it was easier to travel. It was easier to send goods back and forth, even across the region or country, at a minimal cost. So all of those things contributed to the thought that, wow, this is going to be great. This is foolproof, right? Well, also another problem was water. At the time, though, in the 1870s, there had been an unusual number of high rainfall years. Okay, the American Southwest is naturally dry. It's largely a desert. Okay, or if anything else, there's a lot of large scrub brush where you still have an arid climate. You don't get a whole lot of water out there. But in this time period, it coincided with an era where they got a substantial amount of rainfall, far in excess of what they are normally accustomed to seeing. So when people would hear speculation, oh, there's an abundance of water. Oh, great, yeah, well, they arrive and it rains more than they would expect. Okay. The reality was, by the mid 1880s, the region kind of flipped. You had some severe droughts in the mid 1880s, from about 1885 to 1887 or so, that really, really dried things up. Now, I remember 2011. That's the hottest summer I've ever been around. 2011, the DFW area had 71 consecutive days of 100-degree heat. No rain in that time period either. I'm from Texas, and I've seen some really hot summers. That's the worst one I've ever seen. And it was also the driest. It was brutal. I remember seeing cracks in the yard, and like at the school near my house at the time, the front playground type area had huge cracks in it. Everything was dry. Everything was really brown. My yard looked like I was about to bale hay because there was no grass that was alive. It's like this drought is turning us into a desert. Okay, that was basically the same phenomenon that was going on in the 1880s, and that was after a period of years where they had far more rainfall than expected and more rainfall than usual. So some folks resorted to the idea of steel irrigation, where they'd have like a steel windmill and it would try and pump up some water from underneath the ground. Um, they might resort to dryland farming or anything else to try and find techniques. But farmers found that irrigation on a larger scale would not be feasible, largely because the state and federal government didn't have money allocated for resources for large-scale irrigation opportunities. You'd have to be near some sort of navigable stream, river, or creek or something like that, which are fewer and further between out west, and that could be an issue. So various different forms of equipment would need to be developed. For example, it was around this time that barbed wire was developed. Barbed wire was developed as a way to keep cattle contained in certain areas. And it also had the effect of keeping other entities out. Okay? So, barbed wire was invented around this era in the western United States, largely to help the ranching industry, but invariably would affect agriculture as well. However, projects for other things to keep farming, irrigation, and other things in line would be costly and expensive. Another thing that also affected farmers around this time that started to cause some disgruntlement was commercial agriculture. So there's not necessarily a myth, but kind of a myth of Americans being self-reliant in a sense that they can provide for themselves and their own farms. And that's partially true. But the reality is, for people to make a consistent living, they'd have to sell to the open market. They'd have to go into cities, sell. They would try and do to the agricultural community what industrialists did to the industrial economy. And you're going to have to raise your standard of living by selling on the commercial market. The problem is that during this time period, the United States was not the only entity that was also creating large-scale agriculture. You have several different South American countries that were now largely involved in that. Brazil, Argentina, but also Canada became involved in commercial agriculture. New Zealand, Russia, look at the vast expanse that country is. And so you have basically a commercialization and overproduction of agricultural products, which tends to drop the price. Okay? When that happens, you now are struggling to find water, and you're not going to get as much for the resources that you can provide because the prices have dropped significantly. So you're starting to understand that there are some things that aren't quite right. One, the overproduction is frustrating and it's driving down prices. But also you realize that the railroads, which you thought were great because they're cheap to send stuff back and forth, they would buy the land in and around the railroads that went through each and every town. And they would charge high rent in order to be able to grow crops on it or to sell it. They would sell it at a higher price. They would often purchase the grain elevator near a way station off a railroad stop, and they would charge a premium for storage or for movement. And it just became a grievance for farmers to understand these railroads kind of operated at a monopoly, and we kind of operate on their whim. This is not good. The other issue is oftentimes farmers would have to borrow money from banks or other lending institutions. And there had become a money shortage in the United States because the United States backed off its silver currency and backing thereof. There was a little bit less money in circulation. And that lent banks to basically charge whatever so as to recoup some money and extra money. They would charge unusually high interest rates or have more unfavorable loan terms that would make things difficult for farmers to pay back. So you're getting pinched from both sides. You're making less money because your product isn't selling as high as it used to, and yet the money you borrow, you actually owe more because your interest rates are higher. You're making less and you're having to pay more. That's not a good recipe. So a lot of folks had to deal with the idea that they're going to have to sell the farm and maybe even move back east because this is just not a sustainable lifestyle. Some people believe that there was a conspiracy to punish people out west. This is America. Conspiracy theories abound and have had for centuries, but whatever. Some people saw kind of a manipulation, if you will, and they aired their grievances out. So they were really frustrated from the standpoint that they were not making good money. They were in debt. They oftentimes lived very, very isolated rural lives. They did not have access to solid medical care. They did not have adequate schools for children to congregate and actually learn, so you have high illiteracy rates. You have a dearth of cultural activities and things like that where people can congregate. Your neighbor, quote unquote neighbor, might live 20 miles from you. Okay. It's hard to form community when you're so isolated like that. And in the coronavirus era, we understand what isolation's like. This country has lost its mind in the last 6 months. Okay? There's only so many times you can watch Tiger King. All right? But Um, Human beings are not meant to live isolated lives. We are not um, meant to live lives where we have obsolete um, and isolated lives. We're supposed to be around each other. And not only that, there are folks in the cities who would ridicule farmers out in rural areas for being hayseeds and for being simple. FarmersOnly.com, right? Okay. So people feel resentment. They feel like they're being ridiculed. They're having to pay more for the stuff that they borrow. They're having to accept cheaper prices. They live in isolation. Schools aren't really anywhere. And there's a lack of community. So you have this idea that the myth of the West is fading. Okay? People are really struggling to get by. But otherwise, even though you have a growing melee among farmers, you still have the West as a whole. So unlike the romanticism of the cowboys and the trains and other things like that, farmers aren't really benefiting from those. Okay? They're not really a part of the romantic Western vision. But they were aware of their declining position in relation to some things going on out east in major cities. Okay, so there's some things on the horizon out east that we'll talk about in the next chapter.